Good singing tonight. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. For those that may not be familiar with what's happening on Sunday night, visiting or been teaching elsewhere, we've been going through 1 Corinthians letter, highlighting different things along the way, and we're stalling in chapter 7. We talked about it some last week. We dealt with basically the first 9 verses of chapter 7 2 weeks before. I take that back. Last week we did something a little different. A whole lot of dealing with morality in that first section. Fact is, it's very applicable today, the whole chapter, the entire Bible for that matter. But as we're looking at morality issues and what was happening back then of the alternative philosophy, either hedonism, which is everything is pleasure, means it's just super great and it'll bring you towards spiritual growth, and that's what they thought, at least part of the society. And the other society was more of what they call ascetic. That is that, in a sense, if it tastes good, spit it out. It's not good for you. And or sexually speaking. And so nice to be able to talk without the kids being in here to refer to that, because they were looking at 2 different philosophies that existed in that day. And here's the church trying to figure out, what are we supposed to do? Because a lot of them been raised one way and a lot of them the other way. Our society is raising and influencing us by that in so many different ways. I think we need to be on our guard to what's happening and aware of what God still accepts, condones, and does not accept and calls sin. And so we looked at those passages last week. I want to go back to verse 1 though tonight, because it's kind of a jumping off point as we move into the next section of chapter 7, because verse 1 says, "Now concerning the things which you wrote to me." Paul's answering questions, and notice they're plural there, in the things you wrote to me. So it wasn't just that one issue about morality, but they had a lot of questions. And so as we think about what is it, what could have been the questions regarding marriage, as we look at these marriage matters again, that they would have been asking him. Now think about it for just a minute, because again, this is a brand new church, not a brand new one in the neighborhood, like separated from another section and started their own group. This is all new in this whole area. And for the most part, they've grown up in pagan territory and had pagan thinking. And so everything is brand new in their mind. And this idea of hedonism and asceticism is just a part of it. But as they come into the church setting, their questions are just incredible. What do I do, and how do I live, and what does God accept? And when it comes down to marriage, think about it from this standpoint. In the pagan setting, a couple comes in and somebody's talking with them about God's Word. And one of the 2 of the couple starts really tuning into what's being said. The other one disregards, his arm folded. I could care less. And so the gospel is being taught to both, but one of them is taking it in. Eventually, one of them becomes a Christian, and the other one says it's a bunch of foolishness. I like my own lifestyle. I like the hedonism, and I like the pagan prostitutes at the temple, and they had a lot of that. And I think this idea of one God's a bunch of foolishness. You're the pagans, they might say. And that's the way they looked at Paul sometimes. And so what happens to this couple? And so questions might have come out something like this. Okay, I became a Christian and my mate didn't. Now what do I do? Is this right in God's eyes that we stay married? They didn't know. And question along with that, maybe as you're thinking about all these different things here, should I divorce this person right now? Is my marriage unholy in God's sight? Because when I live with this person, he's going back to the temples and he's worshiping all these idols. Am I being polluted spiritually speaking? How do I deal with all this? Can I stay married to a pagan? How much time do I give that person to change? Because, of course, I took some time. He or she didn't come around, but now we've been married a few months, and there's some dissension there, and boy, when it comes down to giving an offering to church, he doesn't like that in the least, and there's so many other questions. Or you could look at a couple, like couple number 2 here. One becomes a Christian, and the other, well, they're not really happy about things, but the wife, we'll just call it that way, is upset about everything, and he's broken heart. What do I do? Am I the one that's causing the struggle in this marriage? Should I quit going to church in order to keep her happy? Those are logical questions. You may not think about it for you, but for people that are coming up within a totally pagan culture that have never really heard anything, except maybe some Jewish influences as far as Scripture is concerned, they're out there. Well, what if I do if he or she leaves? Should I run after her? Should I leave the church in order to keep up with them? Am I still bound to that person? If she moves away and moves in with another person, what am I supposed to do? And so the questions are no telling, a multitude of things. And so Paul is going to start addressing this whole overall thing in verse 10. And so as he comes down to this list of questions, and I make up my own list here. There's no original list out there. We're just speculating about what they might have asked. And so Paul says, not to the married. We're going to come out and talk about this a bit. I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if a brother has a wife who does not believe, and she's willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he's willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if an unbeliever departs, let him depart. Can't really restrain the person, tie him down. So he's just saying, well, that's what happens sometimes. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, or whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Now there's a variety of things I think he's answering here. Principle number one is to realize, as he's talking about this, and starting with, he says, I give this command. There are some principles that are commands concerning marriage. And when Paul says, and we'll read this again, he says, yet not I, but the Lord. He's not saying he disagrees with the Lord, but he's just adding emphasis on it. I'm going to give this command. And it's not only one that you heard from me, but the Lord has also done that. And you can go back to Matthew chapter 5, and we'll refer to that a little bit, or Matthew chapter 19. Some things that Matthew talked about that came from the mouth of Jesus regarding marriage, divorce, remarriage. So he's referring to that, but he's also giving the fact that whatever he's saying is from God. I command this. And Jesus also did when he was on this earth. So he's not really drawing a distinction as if his commands are less or worse than Jesus or anything like that. And as he comes along here a little further in this same area, when he refers to I, but the Lord, verse 12 here, but to the rest, I, not the Lord, say. He's not saying, well, the Lord disagrees with him. But this was a command that didn't come initially in the gospel writing, but it does come from God nonetheless. So again, he's not drawing one line saying one person says one thing and another is saying another thing, but rather he's just making some additional comments. Number one, do not depart. This is an initial command, and the idea is that there's as many excuses back then as there are today of why people separate, why they depart within marriage. They had their things back then. They were asking, I think, some reasonable questions. Quite possibly, you could think about this, that maybe a few of them, after they became Christians, and the one that's more Christian-like in her attitude or his attitude becomes a Christian while they're living with the cranky person all their life and saying, good, now there's an excuse for me to get rid of him or her. And so Paul's dealing with all this. There's lots of excuses. I've heard a variety of things, I'm sure you have. We've fallen out of love. Well, that just settles it then. Love's ended. Let's just not drag it out any further. No sense arguing over things. Let's just split it down the middle. You hear people talking about that. Matter of fact, I've known people through my associations here in Chattanooga where the husband and wife became best friends, even better, that after the marriage was over. And I scratch my head at that, thinking, how can that be? But they couldn't be best friends before, and yet that's the situation. It's not to say that that was the best thing to happen for them. I heard just last week, overheard something on the news about some Hollywood couple. And they had recently separated, and they gave this announcement to the news media. Our marriage has run its course. 2 years was the course. I know you laughed. I mean, and some of them think, whoa, that's a long time, you know, depending on where you're at in our culture. But that's what they think. Now, we laugh about that inside these walls, but the fact is, you go right out the door and all the rest of the people, sure, yeah. And maybe even some other religious groups around the area would say, oh yeah, of course. We got to modernize. We got to keep things going the way it is. Verbal or physical abuse. I don't like the way she's beating me up. She's always cranky and whatever, or vice versa, you know. And wait a minute. That's not the only thing. Well, he or she treats me like this, or I think God is happy with me when I'm happiest, and I'm really not happy any longer in this situation. And on, the number of things. The kids will be happier when we separate because we're not getting along at home. And I've seen the kids' faces and talked to them. Maybe you have. I have a special in-way with a lot of the kids at Boyd Buchanan because Melanie teaches there in this Christian school where over half of them don't come from a Christian background, a Christian life background, most of them. And yet, it's sad. Many of you know, not a lot of you, I grew up in a broken home. And I can tell you, you never get over that. I heard somebody say, well, it takes 2 years to get over divorce, that the kids get over it in 2 years' time. Not so. Not at all. Still frustrates me. I still get angry. I'm 65 now. Happened when I was 8. God's not wanting adults to behave that way. At the very beginning in all of this, he says, do not depart. It tears kids' lives up. It destroys what hope even the adults have as far as in the relationship. As they think about pursuing anything else, it's always more skeptical. God's not intending for us to treat one another that way. So we've got to grow up sometimes and put on the hard helmet or whatever it is and decide I'm going to do. And I'm going to be what I'm supposed to be. And I know Ephesians 5 talks a whole lot, and you've read that probably, about what the wife's supposed to do and what the husband's supposed to do. But Paul never says, when the wife does this, then husband, you're supposed to do that. It's just to say, this is your job, regardless of the circumstance. You are to love your wife like Christ loved the church, even when she doesn't respect, honor, or treat you the way you ought to get, and vice versa. So the emphasis here in verse 17, do not depart. All right, let's read on here a little further here in verse 11 now. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried. See, here's the thing, that Paul may have come into cases where some people have already separated. And he's teaching people that have already done this. Okay, it doesn't mean, well, since you come in this way, you can just go ahead and do it. No, you remain unmarried. Or go back and be reconciled with your partner. And a husband, because it was more legal back then for them, the husbands could divorce. The wife could only just pack up and leave. That was some of the Roman laws that was going on. And so Paul will address it in that tone, but basically the same goes either way, either which direction. And so verse 12 again, when he says, now to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, he's not negating that it's not God's will. But he says, verse 12, if a brother has a wife who does not believe and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. No excuses like that. Don't make up things. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he's willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. Now this matter here in verse 14, kind of strange for some. For the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the wife. Unbelieving husband, is sanctified by the wife. Or in the other situation, reverse, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband if the husband's a Christian. Now that does not mean that if you've got a pagan relationship and all of a sudden one of them becomes a Christian, that the other person is saved, sanctified in that sense. But the relationship itself is still considered holy by God. So I need for myself to choose Christ and to become a Christian. Whether my wife does or not, it doesn't make her a Christian because I've chosen to do that. So he's referring more to the relationship they have that's still holy in God's sight, even if you're married to a pagan. That's just how things are sometimes. And some of us don't realize how pagan our mates are until we get married and get to know them a little bit better. Paul's dealing with a lot of things here. But in verse 15, again, he says, if the believer departs, let him depart. Now, he's not saying that that's what they're working for, but sometimes, an unbeliever rather, sometimes it's just going to happen. And it does happen in our society. They may be a believer or they may not be a believer. It depends on how they look at themselves. But we have people that just say, sorry, I'm out. You chose Christianity. You're doing things this way. I'm out. That's not that person's fault who's trying to follow Christ. And that's the emphasis that Paul's giving here. You can't tie them down and make them stay. Marriage is a choice, just like Christianity is a choice. It's a relationship that's built on two people choosing to stay together. But because someone chooses to live for Christ and the mate finally decides, I'm tired of this, I'm out, doesn't mean that you're guilty for causing that. The only thing you're guilty for is being a faithful Christian. And then as he goes back to that, here he kind of deals with this in verse 16. You can think about this for a moment. Let's say that the guy's the guilty person. He packs up and he leaves because the wife becomes a Christian. So he moves down the street in with some friends, we'll say. And while he's there, he's just cranky and fussy and complaining about the wife. But he notices, through gossip and everything else, she's still a golden individual. Sometimes it takes a while to get around to things. And verse 16 kind of adds to that. For how do you know, O wife, whether you'll save your husband? So we can't predict what's going to happen in the future. I'm going to stay with Christ. That person may fuss about it. They may pack up and leave. I'm going to live the Christian life, regardless of the circumstances. Because I don't know, even though they fuss and complain, what's really going on inside their heart. That someday they may choose. I've been blessed with the privilege of baptizing some people in the latter part of their life that lived along with a mate that was a Christian all her life. And they never chose Christianity. One old fellow who was 86 years old in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And his wife had taught Bible school faithfully, had been so kind and so caring, raised children who became faithful members of the church. The son became a preacher, and he never budged. Go visit old Harold and talk to his son. Never needed to preach to him about what he needed to do to become a Christian, because I felt like all the years he'd been around, he knew a whole lot more about it than I did. As many times as he sat in those church pews with his wife but never responded, he heard the message. So never said a word. Just visit, talk to him, be a friend. Sometimes he'd send me out to the little garden he had out in the back to gather up some greens or this or that to take home, and we'd just visit. And then one day I just walked in and I said, of all the places you've been, how many gospel sermons? I said, how come you never became a Christian? He thought for a second. He started to come up with an excuse, and I said, that ain't good enough. I just cut him off. He looked at me kind of surprised. So he started another excuse. Now, that ain't good enough either. We went on for a little while more, and he just kept looking at me, and I didn't say a word. I prayed hard the whole time, never said a word. Finally, he sat there in his overalls, and he says, let me get my hat. Had to have a hatch, to go anywhere. Went down to the church building. Nobody would have ever thought at 86 years old he'd have done that. Baptized him, and I said, now you need to call your daughter Jean. He goes, okay, I think you're right. She'll want to hear about this. We go into the office, and he dials the phone number, and he says, hello, Jean? He goes, David wants to tell you something. Hands me the phone. And it's like, I take the phone, I'm trying to think of what to say. She goes, he was baptized, wasn't he? She just knew. I said, yeah, it was neat. You never know. You never know what's in your mate's mind. You just stay with the course and keep on. And see, this is part of the message that's being taught to us here. Now, in the rest of this, there's some unusual things going on, talking about live as you called, and he relates to being servants and slaves, or circumcision, non-circumcision, back and forth. And then comes back down to some unusual things as he talks about, depending on your translation, either virgins or whoever's in charge of them. It could be the father, or it could be the person who is betrothed to the virgin. Verse 25, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord. That is, commandment to get married or not to. There's no direction. It's still your choice. I have no commandment from the Lord that I give my judgment as one who the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that it is good because of the present distress, that it's good for a man to remain as he is. You see, persecution had already started in the church. And by inspiration, Paul knew it was not getting better. It was going to be a lot worse. One of the worst things I could ever imagine would be standing in front of a gun like we heard just a few days ago up in Utah, Oregon, and someone pointing a gun at my wife, say, and telling me, if you don't renounce Christ, I'm going to shoot her. Or one of my children. There's a lot of things that were happening back in that day and time also. And so Paul speaks a little prophetically. He says, because of the present distress, it might be better not to marry. Verse 27, are you bound to a wife? Well, do not seek to be loosed. Don't use it for an excuse. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you're not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she's not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh. You see, because of all this. But I'd like to spare you this. And then he comes back to this whole concept of what's going on, or about to. But I say this, brethren, the time is short. So that from now on, even those who have wives should behave as though they have none. It doesn't mean you start treating them ill and bad. What he's dealing with is you better start thinking about what's going to happen in life. I can't imagine. Those who weep as though they do not weep, those who rejoice as though they do not rejoice, and those who buy as though they don't have anything to possess. It was coming soon. And those who are of this world as not using it. For the form of this present world is passing away. But I want you to be without a care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, that he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, and how he may please his wife. Don't we do that? Well, sometimes, ladies, we do. We give it a go, guys, don't we? And a lot of times the ladies do too. You see, he's just trying to let people know there's something happening soon. But as we're looking at all of this, I want you to jump down to verse 37. You'll have to read some of this on your own here. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has his own power over his will, is so determined that in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. Whichever way. Stand strong, stand steadfast. Well, there's a lot more to wrap up in this, but I want to go back and I want to look at two passages that Jesus enlightens us with concerning marriage and divorce and all, because it parallels some of what's happening here. So turn to Matthew chapter 5 for just a moment. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus begins quoting some sayings that are happening back in that day and time. So in verse 21, for instance, he says in Matthew 5, you've heard it said of those of old. This is the saying going around prophetically, basically by the rabbis. This is the catchphrase of how you're to live your life. Basically, he's talking to the Jews. So you've heard it said, this is what you think, that you shall not murder. And whoever murders shall be in danger of the judgment. Verse 22, he says, but I say to you this. Now he's going to go through several successive things. So you'll hear what's being said, like this is the way we ought to live, but I'm going to tell you something else. And I'm going to add to it. Now he comes down in verse 27. So you've heard it said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Not the same as physically doing it. But he's getting to the point of be careful where your heart's going. So he deals with this idea of the right eye. If it's causing you to stumble, pluck it out, etc. But then he jumps in on verse 31. He comes back to this whole issue about divorce. Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Like, I am tired of you. I don't want to live with you. This is a man's society. And I tell you what, I'm going to be nice to you. I'm going to give you a little certificate along with sending you out of the house. So when you pack up and leave with those 3 kids and you head down the road, somebody will know that you actually were married, that you didn't run around like a harlot. That's being kind to you. Now get out. And that's what he's talking about. So Jesus says, you've heard it said, be nice to your wife in this way. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason, did you catch that? Any reason, except sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery, because she's having to pack up and go find somebody to take care of her. And whoever marries a woman who's divorced this way commits adultery. I see one cause, and one cause only, sexual immorality. And you can search through the Scriptures, and as you begin paralleling what's going on in 1 Corinthians 7, you're not going to find anything plainer than what's being said by Jesus right here. Now, once again, in Matthew 19, because it was such a hot issue in that day and time, as well as it is today, he had some people come up and ask him a question about this divorce issue. Great multitudes, verse 2, were following him. He healed people. In verse 3, a Pharisee came, testing him, and said to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? Jesus, I've got you on the spot. That's what he's thinking. Because if you say no, you're going to get in trouble one way. Because there are a lot of people in the audience that have gone up and down and had their issues. If you say yes, you're going to get in trouble with the law. So go ahead, Jesus, give it a stab. Let me see if you can get out of this one. And that's what he's thinking. Verse 4, and he answered, and he said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? Now there's 2 things to highlight here. He's going beyond what the Old Testament law has said, and he goes back to the very beginning of how God has set this thing up to be together. And as I mentioned a couple weeks ago in this issue about homosexuality, Jesus is even addressing that as he talks about this is the way God made it, male and female. He could have put in a little clause there. It's going to change down the way, but he does not. God made them male and female. And for this reason, and he's quoting, strangely enough, what is mentioned in the garden. For this reason, man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the 2 shall become one flesh. Wait a minute. Adam didn't leave a father and mother. He was the first guy. But the principle is being laid out by God Almighty as he's putting together marriage. This is the way it's to be, and this is how they're to be doing it, cleaving to one another. You're so well attached and so connected, you don't think about separating. I know it's going to be tough. That's just part of it. Verse 6, so then they're no longer 2, but one flesh. And wherefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. Literally, let him stop doing this, because it's been happening. Well, not happy with that answer because the Pharisee's looking for a way out. He says, well, why did Moses, verse 7, command to give a certificate of divorce? Well, he answers, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. So you were packing them up and sending them out right and left. And Moses said, if you're going to do that, at least give them a certificate so people know that they in good faith were living with the person they thought was married. So you don't treat them orally. But I'll let you know something, that's not the way God started it. Now, and then in verse 9 he says, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. We could look at that and we could wrestle around with that and throw a twist on it and say, well, that's not exactly what he means. Because if they move away and they live apart for a while, it changes and time changes and whatever. But that's not how the disciples took it, because they had a little comeback for Jesus after he got through there. So his disciples said to him, now this is his own guys, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. And what their meaning, as these guys are, and some of them are married and some of them aren't in the apostleship, you don't know who you're going to get stuck with. And if you can't get out for just any reason, it might be smart not to marry, because you don't know. As we all know, when we marry the person, they're a little bit different after you get married than what you first thought, aren't they? Got one amen finally. Go ahead, Doris, just give him an elbow here, 2 or 3. Or he was speaking for you, right? Okay. So they understood. This is their take on it. Their take on it is there is no other reason except for that one. Now, if they misunderstood, Jesus would have had an option or an opportunity to correct it. But here's what he says in verse 11. But he said to them, all cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it's given. Now, he's not saying, well, if you want to accept it, that's okay, and if you don't, that's okay. Not everybody's going to follow this. But to the ones that understand it, that are given the knowledge of it, they will. And then he says in verse 12, for there are eunuchs, we all know what that means, who are born thus from their mother's womb. There are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men, such as in the case probably in the book of Acts where Philip comes alongside of a eunuch and teaches him. And then he says there are eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the kingdoms of heaven's sake. They chose celibacy because there was no other opportunity in order to be faithful to God for the kingdom of heaven. And so Jesus gives us an answer to what the apostles said, which says, you got it right. There are some people that won't accept this, but to those that have chose that, this is what the kingdom calls for. Of actual obedience to commands that God gives. Realistically, that's what God says. Practically, that's what God says. The thing is, we need to be adults. God expects us as Christians to behave. We're not going to have a perfect life. There are a lot of hardships that are hidden only when you go home. Some of them are exposed in other different ways. But all of us deal with that wrestling of working out relationships. God says, you work on it. That's what God intends for it to do. If you want to plan for how to do it, go to Ephesians chapter 5. Instead of pointing the finger saying, this is what you need to do, what you need to do is look at your side, husband or wife, and say, this is what I'm supposed to do. I can make this marriage work and make it better if I'll do this. Now, that's not a guarantee that husband or wife is going to respond that way. But that is a guarantee that you've done your part. It's such a vital thing for the church that husbands and wives get along. In the home, that's the beginning place of relationships. Kids learn that, we learn that, and then we develop with the rest of the relationships that same way. And if we can't trust one another, we don't treat one another well, we're going to produce kids that do the same thing with a lot of their kids. And we look around our society, and that's what we're seeing. And we'll make a turnaround when we do those things the way God wants us to. Not exactly a Christian spiritual growth lesson, but a doctrinal one just the same, to remind us to live according to what God says. Do what He wants us to do in order to be pleasing to Him. We close the lesson tonight with just a simple invitation. Are you right with God? Have you been a Christian? Have you been baptized into Christ? Are you living faithful? And if not, come down front while we stand and sing, please.